Super excited for this next talk. Everything that we've talked about so far requires money. And I feel like in the federal government, this is often one of the hardest spaces to hack. Many of the approvals go all the way up to Congress, written into policies and laws that can be very difficult to influence. But there are some huge champions that are doing thankless work, trying to inform those processes, inform like National Defense Authorization Acts, and getting some of the things, the tools that we need into the budgeting process. So I'm super excited to have Eric Lofgren. He's a senior fellow at the Center for Government Contracting at George Mason University. And how I know him is he runs a blog that also has a podcast by the same name called Acquisition Talk. Highly recommend, if you're in this space, government or contractor, that you subscribe to Acquisition Talk. It's fantastic. I learned so much on every episode. But without further ado, Eric is going to talk about demystifying the government budget process.
Cool. Thanks, Bryon. And of course, I had Matt and Bryon on the podcast, so definitely check that one out. But so my name's Eric. I actually kind of got my start here as a cost estimator, and I got into the department in the Pentagon right after the Weapon Systems Acquisition Reform Act. So what mattered? Cost growth mattered, right? Getting your documentation, getting cost reports, software resources, data reports, labor rates, all that stuff was really what kind of mattered at that time, baselining your program. And of course, today we're in a very different place, right? Time matters now. Right, we are in a time crunch in a couple spaces. Two imperatives are, one, there's been a bunch of entrepreneurs that have come up, and investors with new companies. Are those companies going to transition? Even if they have the good technology, will they be able to get programs of record and scale within the next few years, or will those investors be disappointed and walk away? The other one is obviously great power competition and the Davidson window. What can we do in the 2020s? So all of that has now changed, and the budget process, the planning, programming, budgeting, reform, or execution process, PPBE, this is actually kind of like one of the big ideas, the big A acquisition things that really matters in terms of getting programs started, and so this is mostly in the Department of Defense. So where's the money at? I just want to kind of go back in time and level set you guys with what the Department of Defense looked like in budgets then and today. Because before the 1960s, we adopted this very Soviet-era model, right? 5-year defense plans, that is our future years defense plan. That's where it came from. But before that, we had a traditional approach. And this here is just an example of the Ordnance Service and Supplies in 1950. And what did they have? There was a big appropriation for the Ordnance Service, and they had all of the arsenals under there. And then they had these broad line items. So procurement of artillery is $103 million at that point. That was in $1950. So this is billions of dollars in one line item. And the leaders of the Ordnance Service could basically say, I want this type of artillery or that type of artillery. I could research and develop a new type of artillery piece. I could just start building out some rounds. I could actually move money between these line items, because really, the appropriation law is I can't move money between appropriations, but between line items, comptroller can just do that, and they did it all the time. They moved money all the time between these accounts and within the accounts to new outcomes. So the traditional budgeting was you basically have inputs, you control inputs, you control the organizations, and then these broad portfolios of line items, and then the outcomes come through the process of these organizations making decisions. But what was the problem there, right? You have like the Army, the Navy, the Air Force. They're all competing after World War II. They all want to do missiles. They all want to do radars. There's so much duplication. At one time, there was 30 different missile projects that were getting started in the 1940s, and they killed them all. They were like, we can't have all this. There's only 2 that survived. And so what was one of the big things that started the debate was this idea of the supercarrier, the revolt of the admirals. So we have nuclear weapons now. How are you going to deliver those weapons? Well, I could have a supercarrier, right? Get planes closer to the point of attack to do nuclear retaliation. Or I could have a long-range bomber, the B-36 Peacemaker at this point, which was replaced by the B-52. So this, of course, this was during the drawdown after World War II. There's not enough resources for everybody. I can't tell the Navy not to do this because they had these broad line items. They could do what they wanted. And the same with the Air Force. There was a big struggle at the time. These technical services could do what they wanted, and the general staffs basically could inform them, but they couldn't tell them what to do. So what was the needed reform here was, well, let's just make the budget, let's make resources attached to weapons programs so we can say, oh, I see you're doing a super carrier, you're doing a super bomber. These are going for the same nuclear retaliation mission. We can't afford both of them. We're going to select the very best one. We're going to cancel the super carrier, and of course they did. That led to the revolt of the admirals. There's a lot of consternation over that. But this was kind of the beginning of this idea of let's change the budget from inputs to outputs. And that's super important because when you go to an output, you now have to predict what that output is and then create this basically waterfall, right? It instantiates these industrial era methods of a waterfall kind of specification, go build mentality. And that's where the programs really come from. So the PPBE, Planning, Program, Budgeting Reform, was really to actually clamp down and say we need to have programs as the basis of our budget. So we're tying together military plans and resources explicitly. And now what do we have? We have these things called programs of record. There's no such thing as a program of record in the 1950s and before. It's a completely made-up thing. And now we just take it as law in the Department of Defense because this is how you get capabilities, programs of record, right? And here's an example, right, of a program of record. This is the Columbia class, the new big ballistic missile submarine. It's actually broken up into all these little program elements, but the program of record has many of these. And that's because they span different types of appropriations. You have to walk that linear down the line from research to prototype to full-scale development, and then you go into test and evaluation and procurement. So it's kind of like spread out all across these things, but I can't just move that from Columbia class to a different type of submarine or to a surface ship, right? They're kind of locked in there. And you have that for many years. You have to make a 50-year prediction, basically, of how long these things are going to predict. So it's a huge upfront cost, transaction cost, to start something new. All you want to do is just show something small and then iterate and scale when necessary. But this doesn't really allow for that kind of optionality. All right, so this is how detailed the line items actually get here. The research development, test, and evaluation program elements for FY21, the median program element was $29 million, right? So that's actually pretty small, and like when you look at this relative to some venture investors, right? The average size of a Series A might be about $10 million, right? Series B might be like $20, $30 million. But these are full programs of record here. And these are program elements within a year. So there's a lot of micromanagement going on. In the entire acquisition funding streams, there's 1,700 program elements, and they're very small, and you actually have to plan them at a much lower level. So we'll get into that a little bit, but you'll see here the counts and the medians for each of the services. And this really has a big impact on cycle time, right? So I just want to show you real quick here that, okay, you got your SBIR Phase 2, right, Small Business Innovation Research, or you did an S&T effort, some IRAD that you've done, you have an MVP, you're ready. Usually, like what we've seen, at least in the literature, in terms of time to commercialization from a prototype, it's 1 to 2 years. And here's a good example for different types of technologies. Biotech is about 2 years or 3 years even from that prototype to commercialization. But for most of these, about 1 to 2 years. The full time from initiation to commercialization is about 3 years. And this seems to be pretty stable from reports from the 2000s to today. So you get your MVP, you should be commercialized in 1 to 2 years. You should be getting revenue from the Department of Defense if you have product market fit, right? You should be. But what actually happens, right? The department doesn't have money for you. Maybe it wants it. Maybe you have a user that says, this is exactly what I need, but that doesn't mean that you're going to actually be able to get money anytime soon. There's not a requirement for you, right? Even if there was a requirement that you're fulfilling, you're considered a new start. You don't actually, you can't just reallocate current resources to get you money. So you have to wait it out, right? And this is the cycle time mismatch here. Like this 30-month rapid acquisition decision time is actually kind of like a best case in many scenarios. I'm saying 3 years to get a requirements approved. It actually takes 800 days on average for a regular program. But let's just say 3 months because you're using a special authority like middle tier. You get your acquisition decision memorandum signed 3 months later. Usually it takes 2 months to get a regular acquisition decision memorandum. But we're saying, again, rapid acquisition like middle tier. And then it's going to take you up to like 2 to 3 years, right? And I don't want to go through all of these steps when you submit your program objectives, memorandum, and all that. Basically, it looks like just a bunch of documents and a bunch of meetings. And you start with the action officers, which are majors in each of the services, and then those go up, and then you say, I want this new capability. Do you have the requirement? Is it approved? Did you get the acquisition decision memorandum? Okay, we can start putting money to you, right? But that kicks off the process of approvals throughout Congress. Every new start is an act of Congress, right? Like, think about that. You want to start something new in the department, you have to get an act of Congress from 4 committees, and you have to go through probably 12 layers of bureaucracy in the Department of Defense itself. So anyway, by the time that you eventually get money for this new start, it's going to be about 27, 30 months, right? You've already, like, for these companies that have been working on something, they should have commercialized within 1 to 2 years. They don't even know if the money's there yet because the appropriations hasn't passed. But they need to get to funding, right? They're burning cash, they're building out something. They've completed the next round of product development. They should be showing some kind of product market fit, getting towards some revenue, but it's still up in the air. And so most of the time you need, the data varies, but about 18 months is the average for what we see for all different funding rounds. It's about 18 months between funding rounds. The longest is about, like, within 30 months, 85% of all venture companies needed to have gone through another funding round at that time. So you get this huge misalignment of funding from the private capital and from the Department of Defense. And of course, that's going to be a problem, right? So I want to just kind of keep moving. What's going on here? You're going to have low revenues. The probes aren't passed yet. One of the issues is you bring in a new requirement. You got that program of record. Well, you're going to have to compete it out, right? You're not necessarily going to get that sole source. Some people will get a sole source phase 3 if you went through the small business innovation research projects. Or if you did an other transaction. But for the most part, they're just going to compete it out. A lot of other transactions actually do get recompeted out after a successful prototype through the federal acquisition regulation. So financing becomes hard here. All right, so how do we kind of hack this? I mean, there's all sorts of in-year of execution funding, right? It takes 2 to 3 years just to get a new appropriation. You have to start at the front end of that to get a little wedge in the budget, right? And you have to have all of that documented up front. So that's really it takes 3 to 5 years normally to start something new. That's relatively significant, but you can kind of hack that. So what are some sources of innovation funding? Well, first, we have these core tech transition funding accounts. The Joint Capabilities Tech Demonstration there on the bottom, Emerging Capabilities Tech Demonstration, Quick Reaction. These are all of these are at the OSD level for the most part. The Rapid Innovation Fund, that's one that you could get up to like $3 million. They raised it to $6 million. It was kind of like that bridge after a small business innovation research. So you can get some funding, and then that keeps you alive until someone can like program some money, find some money in a program of record so you can get recurring revenue. What do you want? You want recurring revenue. That's what you're trying to get to. These things are kind of like the bridges to get there. But the Rapid Innovation Fund, the department never actually requested it. Appropriations just gave it to them, and they're just like, well, you're not using it, or we don't like trust you with it, or you're not even asking for it, so we're going to cut you off. There's several other ones, the AppFit and the Raider. But these are all really hard to get to. You have to know every single one of them. They all have a different selection process. They tend to take a year, maybe even more than a year, to actually go through the proposal process and get these types of funding. So it's like, I want it within a year of execution money. I figured something out. I want to get the money within 6 months to a year. Well, this is going to take you even more than that. So it's supposed to be the core rapid acquisition, tech transition funding, but it's really not that rapid after all. SBIR and STTR funding, again, this funding only fits for phase 1 and phase 2. Of course, you have like the AFWERX StratFis that get you $10 to $15 million, and they pair it with other organizations. But this is actually pretty significant, right? It's over $2 billion now. About 2/3 of that comes from the government. About 1/3 is actually obligated through like a prime or something like that. But these aren't necessarily the best place. That's not like a tech transition account. When you go to a phase 3 for a SBIR, you can't draw from the SBIR money. You have to take program money. Secondary sources, manufacturing technology, the counterterrorism. There's some other small things. These are pretty small. So there's there's prototyping accounts that are not tied to programs of record in Budget Activity 6.4, which is the prototyping account. These include the Air Force Tech Transition Account, the SOCOM ATD, the Army Technology Maturation Initiative. Again, these are pretty useful because you don't have to go through, again, multiple years to get something exactly approved just to go get the money. But again, these things are overprescribed, and it often takes a year or two to get money out of these things anyway. So pretty hard. Putting these sources in perspective, on the right there, you'll see that the sources of tech transition funding are actually relatively small, right, compared to the total RDT&E. And this is including Budget Activity 8 and other offices that have flexible funding, like the Strategic Capabilities Office, like the Space Development Agency. The JAKE is another one, which is now the Chief Data and AI Officer. But yeah, this is one of the problems, right? Everything's programmed. Like, all the money's already spoken for. How do you get to new money? It takes you years to get to new money. And that's one of the things that, as a company, if you're trying to do business with the Department of Defense, you're just going to have to know you're going to go through multiple funding gaps that are very significant in time. And do you have the capital and resources to kind of stick it out? So what other ways can we get to year of execution funding within the department? Reprogramming. So reprogramming is basically like, I put money to the F-35 and to the F-16, but now I'm actually executing. I want to move money between them and make trade-offs, right? Well, that again, you can do that, but you have to do it below threshold. So there's a below threshold reprogramming level. If it's less than $10 million, if it's 10 million or less, then you can kind of move money around between RDT&E. So if I have an F-35 program element, I can move $10 million out of that. Or 20%, whichever's less, right? Whichever's less. So for an F-35 program element that's like $1 billion, right? $10 million is going to be less than 20%. But for smaller program elements, you might get to the 20 million. Now, making those transitions below threshold, right? So I could probably get $10 million. I have to find the source. I can get $10 million. Well, it still takes multiple levels of bureaucracy, probably a couple months to go actually get that process. But if it's above that threshold, or it requires a new start, right? So I'm starting something new that's not already justified in the budget I submitted 2 years ago. Now I need to go get an act of Congress, right? So that's an above threshold reprogramming. If I want to move money between appropriations accounts, between program elements within an appropriation, or do a new start or terminate something that I'm already doing, I need to get an above threshold reprogramming. That can take 6 months. Usually it goes through, again, 12 layers of bureaucracy, including Office of Management and Budget, and then it goes to the 4 committees, and then they vote on it. Usually they put them into an omnibus and sit on it for a while, and then they make a decision. So it's not the best. And since the border wall reprogramming, of course, where Trump basically ordered you take money from certain accounts and push them to the border wall and MilCon, actually, one of the things is all this stuff on reprogramming, there's no legal basis for it. It's just what Congress and the executive have handshaked on, because the department can move money however it wants between appropriations and within appropriations. The only limit is between appropriations, it can only do up to $2 billion, but it doesn't require any congressional actual approval. That's just something that's kind of like a handshake and a nod. And so when Trump did that, it was completely legal, but now you broke the trust, and now Congress doesn't trust you. So Congress is really pushing back on budget flexibility and the ability to do these things because they see the department doing sketchy things they don't like, so they pull it back, right? So you'll see here, procurement went from 20 million to 10 million, and O&M also went from 20 million down to 10 million, so they're actually taking away reprogramming authority. Here's the reprogrammings over time, and you'll see that the Nixon impoundment in the 1970s really cut the amount of reprogramming that was possible. When we went to the global war on terror, you got a little bit more, especially the Iraq surge, but now it's coming back down. The total flexibility within an RDT&E or a procurement account is 3 to 7%. So procurement overall, if you add up all the BTR and all the ATRs that are done in an entire year, for an appropriation, it's about 3 to 7% for procurement, and you'll see RDT&E much lower. It's harder to move RDT&E funds. And those are actually declining, right? So we're seeing over time that we're getting less and less flexibility over time as these global wars on terror kind of, and those emergencies are going down. But we have new types of emergencies. They're prospective emergencies. We don't want to wait until a DDG gets sunk So we're just talking about in the Taiwan Straits before we start moving money fast and doing what we need to do all along. All right, so here's a JUON's case study, which is the Joint Urgent Operational Needs Statement. This was supposed to kind of like collapse a lot of the cycle time, right? Like, people are dying. I need to get this now. If you look at this, it still took them 4.5 months with the Joint Rapid Acquisition Cell and everybody's leadership up and down the line to even find some money. And that's the longest part of this whole acquisition, this timeline here. Contracting was half a month. Once they got the money, it was out the door, right? Delivery was just within 4 months, they were actually delivering to the field what was needed. Funding still took forever. Okay, so where do we go from here, right? It's probably got to look something like portfolios. What is PPBE reform? PPBE reform, reforming that system, is nothing more than the delegation of authority and accountability to the people who have the most local knowledge to make the decisions at the most relevant times, right? Someone in Congress, it's just impossible, it's literally impossible that people in Congress, when you have a staff of 10, can know everything about what's going on in such a complex, basically, economy as the Department of Defense. So how do you maintain oversight and accountability, right, at the same time that you want to be able to move fast, right? So we're thinking, well, you could probably look at other places internationally in the private sector. How do they do this? But there's lots of ways that you can classify money, right? One is the performance budget, like the Air Force Flying Hour program. Like, I'm flying this many hours. How much does it cost me per flight hour? I'm going to budget to a number of flight hours. That's a performance budget. That's in the O&M side. The program budget is what we really have for research and development and procurement, which is a weapon system output. You could have other types of budgets, like a mission or a capability. So C4ISR, you could imagine just having a capability stream of C4ISR. I could have all sorts of different sensors come out of that, and different types of algorithms or different types of communications, waveforms, but I'm not specifically identifying every single one of those and making them their own little programs. Mission would be something like a Pacific Deterrence Initiative, or like, here's a challenge, stop an invasion of Taiwan. Here's a bunch of money, here's like a bucket of money to help you go do that mission. Or you could have organization and object. So an object budget is like military pay. We already have those. An organizational budget, that's what we used to have, but you can imagine a budget that goes straight to a program executive office or to a systems command and say, here's your portfolio of money, get after the requirements, you can move money around within there, report back what you're doing. Okay, so this is what PE consolidation, program element consolidation could look like. The Space Force had a recommendation in 2020 where they wanted to consolidate their program elements and get execution flexibility through that kind of portfolio management. So here you'd see, okay, I have research, development, test, and evaluation. There's literally, there's hundreds of these things, of these program elements. But here I have, AEHF, I have a weather system, I have a polar mill SATCOM. These are different program elements right now, and once you budget to them, you can't move money between them, right? They're like kind of walled off. I need a reprogramming authority. Well, couldn't you just kind of like, bucket those all together? I'm not losing any insight at the lower levels, right? I'm still showing you at the lower level, but if I have one consolidated program element like space support to operations, a capability stream, then I can kind of make trade-offs between these systems in a relevant time without getting an act of Congress. Or if you handle the New START authority, then you can start onboarding new companies and new solutions and tying off those old ones without, again, getting an act of Congress. All right, so how does oversight kind of work in these different streams? You have a PPBE kind of set of items, right? You fix a technical baseline. You get a life cycle cost estimate. You do your affordability analysis to make sure that the future implications of my choices work. I get a schedule, right? I have to have a very well-defined integrated master plan. And then my budgeting, I budget to that specific project. I have to know exactly the output. And again, that works. If I'm building a bridge, right? Everyone knows how to build bridges. Civil engineers have done this for a lot of time. You can analyze the situation, optimize what you're going to build, and then create an execution plan, right? And that's like, design or like measure twice, cut once. That's kind of the idea behind a lot of this stuff, because when the RDT&E, it's about 10% of a weapon systems acquisition costs. Most of it, 60 to 70%, is in sustainment. So you want to make sure you get everything right before you start cutting metal. Well, software is different, right? Where like the code is the specification. There is no like defined specification up front that you just follow and implement like you're kind of going down a production line. And then AI is even worse, right? Because it's like, how do you make a prediction about your prediction model? You can't really. How do you know how much data you needed before you started collecting the data to get you to this type of waypoint navigation accuracy? You can't. So it breaks that model. All right, so what does portfolio substitute look like in each of these little areas? Well, product roadmap and prioritization in the requirements. How do you kind of iterate through those requirements from a high-level outcome rather than predefining all those little things? Tracking those actuals and just, let's do things incrementally. Let's track actuals and support decisions as they're needed and not say I can life cycle cost this thing before I start. Doing value analyses, getting actual warfighter exercises, and then you fund enduring capabilities. So a lot of the enabling capabilities for like an enterprise IT build, a lot of those things, it's not like a program necessarily. It's more like you want to just fund development teams that have specific like things that they're working on, give them a level of effort, and then hold them accountable and repeatable, right? So today we rely on a baseline. Tomorrow we need to rely on a context, right? Context is hard to kind of convey to the higher levels, and that's going to be some of the challenge. How do we actually do that oversight? But I want to give you a little PPBE reform history here. The traditional budgeting paradigm, agility and effectiveness was actually increasing. Up through the 1950s and 60s, we started to see the problem was actually we're transitioning too many things in the 50s, right? Everyone's like, you can't have all these missiles, they're going to be unaffordable. Well, that was actually very innovative, and that multi-buyer nature of defense at that point with the competition inter-service was actually pretty innovative at that time. But since we got PPBE, what have we been having? Lots of more paperwork and cycle times increasing. PPBE, it's hard to disaggregate that from the requirements process or the acquisition process because the requirements process didn't exist prior to PPBE, right? Life cycle cost estimates didn't exist before PPBE. The whole idea of a program of record is PPBE, right? Now, you might want programs for certain things, but not for everything. As I said, there's lots of different ways you can structure the budget, and we probably need all of those different things to be tried within the Department of Defense. And so what's the idea here? Budget portfolios and execution flexibility is consistent with the United States tradition of liberal democracy and congressional power of the purse. We did it before when people say, well, if Congress can't tell you, I want this many F-35s in 2045, then we don't have the power of the purse and this is like unconstitutional. Well, no, that's just flat out not true because that's not how it worked for, from the founding fathers all the way through the 1950s and 60s. We can do speed and rigor at the same time. It just requires us to kind of break these industrial age and really Soviet era ideas of how we should manage a non-market structure. And the last thing I'll say here is that PPBE was tried in many countries and in many departments throughout the government, and it, in every single case, has failed. Every country it has been tried in France, in Sweden, in the UK, and throughout all of the Eastern European countries after the fall of the Berlin Wall. All of them failed. Australia, it failed. New Zealand, it failed. The Department of Education, it failed. So it's funny. What I like to say is the Department of Defense, the only reason it can have such a system is because it has such dedicated and smart personnel that they can actually operate under such a thumb. So that's about it. I got 50 seconds, but we can, if there's one question.
I've got one question for you, Eric. So you mentioned PPBE reform. Can you provide any insight into how that's going and when that's going to come out?
Yeah, there's a PPBE commission that was in the FY21 or 22 NDA. They're just getting started now. So by the time that they kind of actually have a report and stuff starts to happen, it's a couple of years. We need to kind of do stuff faster. So I don't know. I just hope that they're going to make big muscle movements. There's more interest around this. And I think the fact that there's a lot of more venture capital kind of coming in this time, is getting more push. But we'll see if it can get over the hump. But yeah, PPBE Reform Commission, one can only hope. All right, thanks.